Octavius Obe here on YouTube, and my guest today is special. Of course, all of my guests are special, but when I started this YouTube journey, he was my very first guest, and I'm glad to have him back. Dr. Elwood Dunn is the Arthur Neagley Professor of Politics Emeritus, University of the South, Sewanee, Tennessee, former Minister of State for Presidential Affairs under President Tolbert, and a consultant to Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, former editor of the Liberia Studies Association. He's authored more than 30 books and articles, among them Historical Dictionary of Liberia, which he co-authored with Doctors Burgess and Bian. Let's begin by looking at some of the highlights of your career. You served in academia, you served the government of Liberia. Just give me one or two highlights of your career.
Well, I spent most of my life as a professor and researcher, 35 years of my life doing that. So that has to be number one. I had the opportunity to spend 6 years of my life serving the government of Liberia, 3 years at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the other 3 years at the Executive Mansion, first as a Deputy Minister of State for Presidential Affairs and subsequently as the Minister of State for Presidential Affairs for, I think it was about 6 months before the coup took place. So that's it.
Let's go back to the beginning, where the Dr. Dunn story actually starts. Buchanan, that's where you were born. Talk to us a little bit about your parents. You speak rather fondly of your grandparents in the book. Uh, and this is the book we're discussing today, A Liberian Life by Dr. Elwood Dunn. Here is what it looks like, and it's available now from Brill Publishing.
Well, as I pointed out in the book, though I had a mother and a father, I felt that I was born to Mary A. Mason and Thomas A. Mason, my maternal grandparents, largely because I was born in their house and they took care of me to adolescence. And so they are closest to me. And for all practical purposes, consider them my parents. Now, of course, I know that their daughter was my mother, and my father was a man called Edward L. Dunn, who at the time of my birth was superintendent of Grand Bassa County. And so I had a very uh, difficult relationship with my father until I became an adult, fully an adult, when the relationship was a little bit more normal at that point.
So you became an Episcopalian later on. Uh, you've written another book among the many books you've written uh, on the history of the Episcopal Church in Liberia. What denomination did your parents belong to, and how did you become an Episcopalian?
Well, when I was basically born in the two grandparents who were members of the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So I was baptized, as they used to call it, christened at the time. I was baptized as an infant in that church and basically grew up in that church until probably I was about maybe 12 or 13 years of age, when then I switched to the Episcopal Church, largely due to the influence of my father.
You came to the University of Liberia, and while there, because the transition from Lower Buchanan to Monrovia was a pretty big one, wasn't it?
Surely, because all my life I had spent at home in Grand Bassa County in Lower Buchanan. Um, and so coming to Monrovia was a new experience. And I think that the people and the institutions that I encountered played a big part in shaping what I subsequently became. And the people I'm talking about are those at the Trinity Cathedral, the late Father Seth C. Edwards, who was at that point former president of Cuttington College, as we called it then, and the Reverend Canon Burgess Carr, who was assistant to Father Edwards. And through them, I got to know quite a bit about the YMCA. There was a man called David Howell, who was the Secretary General of the YMCA. Through them, I got to meet a man called Benny Warner. I got to meet a man called uh, Yancey Peters Fla, and a number of other people, Henry Reed Cooper, and a number of others.
I was telling you in the pre-interview that I ran the interview by my father-in-law, and he said that you were really very, very knowledgeable about the Bible. And there was a time they all thought you were going to become a priest. But in the book, I like the phrase you used. You said you realized at one point that your calling was in the ministry of diplomacy. Uh, how did you leave that potential priesthood to go into diplomacy and international relations or public service?
Well, you know, I transferred from the University of Liberia to Cuttington in my junior year. And it was with a view to studying theology that I did the transfer to Cuttington. While at Cuttington, I found that the School of Theology was not in operation, and there was very little plan on the part of the church to reopen the school. I think that was one important factor in my decision not to continue to study. I mean, not to pursue the study of theology. But I guess my exposure to other things played a part as well. And what I mean by that, particularly, um, is a book that I read by Professor Hans Morgenthau called Politics Among Nations. And it influenced my thinking quite a bit. And I thought that I had the temperament to become a diplomat. And so I began to shift in that direction.
Okay. I'm going to backtrack a little bit now and go to the book. You said the year 1961 also witnessed the Monrovia Conference of Independent African States. I experienced the excitement of the frequent movement of presidential motorcades as more than 20 African heads of state were in Monrovia. Uh, I know this was at the time you were at the University of Liberia before you went to Cuttington. Did that also have any influence in your decision at all, seeing that multiplicity of state power on display? Did that have any effect on you at all?
It's possible because I think what I was witnessing without at that time being fully aware of it was the process of the organizing of African unity in the aftermath of the decolonization of African states that was actually underway at that point in time. And so I was there, I was a student at the university in my sophomore year, I believe, in 1962 when the Monrovia Conference took place. And that was the Monrovia Conference that assembled the largest number of African states to talk about this question of what form should unity in Africa take. I think it was probably the same year, probably the year before, that the Casablanca Group met in Morocco, and that was a much smaller group, probably not more than maybe 5 or 6 countries. Yeah, something in that neighborhood. So it's very possible that that influenced my thinking as well. When I got to Cuttington, I saw a video of the founding conference of the Organization of African Unity. This is 1963. I think it was May of 1963. And so, in my mind, what I was witnessing happening was the process of Africa organizing itself to face the modern world, if you will.
Okay, so you get to Cottonton, and there is a visit of an important African uh, international figure, the late Tom Mboya. Put into context Mr. Mboya's visit at that time uh, in terms of the multinational nature of Cuttington and the liberation struggle on the continent at the time. And tell us who Tom Mboya was for our younger generation.
Well, let me make a correction there. Tom and Boyer visited Cuttington before I got to Cuttington. I was not there when he came probably a year or two before I got there. But I did hear about the visit. Now, Tom Mboya was one of the leading African nationalist leaders from Kenya in this particular case. I think he was part of a labor union movement, uh, so prominent that his name was frequently mentioned as a possible president, future president of Kenya. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1969. But yes, beside Tom and Boya, what I encountered at Cuttington were students from a number of African countries. Some of them already independent, such as Nigeria and Ghana. Some of them about to become independent, such as what was called Rhodesia at the time, Swaziland, Botswana. We had students from all of those countries. From Ethiopia, we had students. And so one had a sense that one was in the midst of the rest of Africa that was emerging into statehood, into nationhood at that point in time.
And how did these students end up on Cottonton?
Well, I think, if I remember correctly, the United States Agency for International Development, in its efforts, in the American government's efforts at supporting the liberation process, uh, provided scholarship to these students to come to Liberia. I'm sure there was some discussion with the Liberian government about this. That is one of the ways that you can contribute to the process of African decolonization is to invite students to Liberia, and I'm sure somewhere at the University of Liberia as well. But I'm talking about those that I encountered at Cuttington, and we, the U.S. government, would finance it. So they were financed by USAID, and this is how it come the way brought to Liberia.
So you get to Cottonton initially to study theology, but the school is not functional. What did you study at Cottonton?
Yes, I studied then political science. Called sometimes people refer to it as just social science, but political science was the emphasis. Political science, international relations, all of that together, if you will.
And then upon graduation, you were employed as a clerk typist at the Department of State.
Yes, yes, I was fortunate in getting that position because to me it was a logical move, given what I had read and what I had begun developing an interest in, rather than moving into teaching as some of my older friends had tried to sway me. I joined the Department of State as a clerk typist, but I was there in the midst of what was happening, and this is how I got my opportunity, for example, to go to France.
On your way, you ran into the French ambassador at the time, Monsieur Gabriel Morand, I believe, and he said to you, go to France, get an education, come back and become president. The larger question surrounding that is, have you ever thought about becoming president of Liberia? You worked for President Tolbert. You literally ran the country with him.
I don't think it's part of my temperament to move in that direction. I have always seen myself, when I was serving in government, more as a technocrat, as someone who would serve as a principal aide to somebody, which I did do, first to Cecil Dennis and subsequently to President Tolbert. No, at all times in my life, I've seen myself as someone who would somehow alternate between service in government and an academic career. That's how I saw myself. If I had stayed in government up to the end of President Tolbert's term, which was to be in 1983, I believe, then I saw myself either going to the University of Liberia or Cuttington at that point in time, unless someone else decided to invite me to service in government.
So you get to France first, Bordeaux, and then subsequently Lyon. How was the language situation? Did you? I mean, what were some of the challenges you faced?
Well, the first challenge I faced was that I didn't know the language, and I wondered to myself why I decided to come to France. When I was there, I began to have doubts about whether I would ever acquire the language sufficiently to study in France. But when you are immersed in a society where a particular language is spoken, something miraculous happens and you begin to pick it up. And that's how after the first 6, 8 months, I began to acquire the language. I spent a total of 2 years in France. So I was able to acquire proficiency in the language before I asked to transfer to the United States.
And the language issue for me is kind of interesting because in the book you said that you, uh, being from Lower Buchanan, you learned how to speak Bassa, and then you subsequently lost the ability to communicate in Bassa. But yet you get to France, and you didn't just learn French. Now he's being modest. You become competent enough to the point where you even serve as a translator for Minister Dennis later on. We'll get to that story. But how did you lose the ability to speak Bassa, but yet acquire the ability to speak French?
I don't know, but I think it was a traumatic experience that I had, and I described that in the book. That is, I was doing some translation of from Bassa to English for my stepmother, and my father walked into one of the sessions and screamed at me, and that had such an I didn't know at that point in
Wow.
time that it would have impacted me in the way it did, and did not know I had lost the Bassa until I found myself in France, and this guy speaks to me in Bassa. I'm hearing what he is saying, but I'm not able to respond. When I try to respond, rather than Bassa coming out, French comes out, and so at that point it was clear that I had lost it.
Okay. So you get in France. You stayed only 2 years instead of the full required to complete your studies. You decided to come to the United States. What happened, and how did you leave France to come to the United States? And where in the United States did you come to when you left France?
Yeah. Well, after 2 years in France, I got to appreciate better the French educational system, and therefore to appreciate how long it would take for me to achieve the the degrees that I had in mind. And I said to myself, going to the United States is going to be a shorter period than remaining in Europe. And that was my major reason for making the transfer, for requesting, I should say, first of all, requesting of the Ministry of Education at the time. And I think Dr. Augustus Keene was the Secretary of Education at the time. And he was kind enough to grant my request for transfer. And so I transferred to Washington, D.C. and to the American University.
But before American University, you actually applied to go to Howard, though, right?
That is true. And I describe in the book that when I showed up at Howard University, uh, somehow my documents could not be located. And this is why I moved and subsequently got admitted to American University.
So you enrolled at American University, you say, in the late 60s, 67, 68, somewhere there. And among the people who influenced you intellectually, you had people like Innis Claude, Joseph Nye, Hans Morgenthau, whose books you read earlier, Dr. Henry Kissinger, Professor Ali Mazuri, and Dr. Wilmot Blyden. What? were some of the ideas, summarily now, from these intellectuals that had an impact on you, and how?
Well, basically, we were in the midst of the Cold War, so we're talking power politics and how nations get around to determining what their national interests are and how they pursue their national interests. And this is, in essence, what we're getting from, if you will, the call them the liberal theories of world politics that were being propounded by some of those authors that I just mentioned. Um, so that was that on that front. The other front was, of course, the writings of Edward Wilmot Blyden, which is in another category all by itself. And that category had to do with the beginnings of Pan African thinking, if you will. And Edward Wilmot Blyden, of course, was a Liberian. He came to Liberia at a very early age and completed all of his formal education in Liberia and became a leading intellectual and writer and so forth and so on. And was one of the, I think, major proponents of uh, bringing together indigenous Liberians and Liberians of repatriate background uh, at that 1850s, 1860s period. He was beginning to talk about this. And he influenced a number of people subsequently, one of them being Louis Arthur Grimes, who became Chief Justice of Liberia, and his children that I got to know. Rudolph Grimes was Secretary of State, Mary Antoinette Brown Sherman, who was President of the University of Liberia. So that that led me in a direction that I believe I'm still following today.
Around 1968, that's when you were at American University. In a book, I find that you make a rather interesting comparison uh, between that time and the killing of George Floyd.
Well, I mean, we're talking about the civil rights movement in the United States. I was in a class one evening at American University, probably around 7, 8 o'clock in the evening, and the news came that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King had been shot dead, and Washington was in turmoil. The country was in turmoil subsequently. So it's very easy for us to look at what happened at that point in time and what happened many decades later in the case of the killing of George Floyd. I think it has uh, the thing that it has in common is the way African Americans were treated in the United States back in the 60s and the struggle to overcome that. And we come many decades later, and apparently very little had changed in that particular area when we look at the tragedy of the killing of George Floyd.
Okay. So I'm going to stay on the theme of tragedy a little bit. You experienced tragedy recently with the passing of your wife, uh, Matilda. What kind of a woman was she? What were some of the traits that made you say, okay, this is the one I'm going to marry?
Well, I think that she came from a family that trained her well. Um, she had a very strong sense of family. And I think that is what enabled us to raise four beautiful children, four very smart children, two female, two male. Um, she found her vocation when we came to Sewanee, the University of the South, because it was there that while she was um, teaching biology at the high school there, she had taught biology earlier at the University of Liberia for the 5 6 year period that we were in Liberia after graduate school. But in Sewanee, she developed an interest in the church and became a one of the lay leaders, if you will, in the chapel at the university. Subsequently, she felt a calling to ministry, so she applied and was accepted at the School of Theology, where she attended, did the Master of Divinity degree. She was ordained to the diaconate and then subsequently to the priesthood. I should add that she subsequently did a D-Min, a Doctor of Ministry program, and she then we then basically moved from residency in Suwanee to Chattanooga to give her an opportunity to practice her calling. And she served in a number of churches as a priest in the Chattanooga area.
You after graduation, instead of going back to work, you stayed for the PhD. You get the PhD, then you come to Liberia, where you go to work for Minister Cecil Dennis at the Foreign Affairs for Foreign Ministry, right?
Yes.
And your first job, did you work another job, or was the Foreign Service Institute your first opportunity at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
No, when I first taught at Seton Hall University for 4 years before going home. Yeah. So I get home and I'm appointed Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs for American Affairs. And with that came the responsibility of organizing the Foreign Service Institute, which had not been operational the few years before that, before my arrival there. So I had a dual responsibility. That is, Assistant Minister for American Affairs and Director of the Foreign Service Institute. So what I did then was to organize a session, meaning a session for training those who were interested in considering the foreign service as a career. And I mentioned in the book some of the people who enrolled at the school.
Yeah, you had a lot of students, of course, while you were there, but some interesting names pop up in the book: Olivia Shannon, Sylvester Gbaintor, Miata Fahnbulleh, Jonathan Reffel, and Miller Buchanan.
Yes, those are some of the students that come to mind, but we had quite a number of others. I believe probably we had something close to 100 students during that. I think it was probably a 6 month period.
And all of these, the names I just called, I think only Miller Buchanan went on to a career in diplomacy. Who were some of the other prominent students who went on to a career in the Foreign Service from the time from your tenure at the Foreign Service Institute?
I don't know if, yeah, I don't know. I think Bento probably is one of those that probably went into the foreign service. Um, there was a guy called Harry Taft Freeman. I know he also went into the foreign service. The last time I remember hearing about him, he was perhaps minister counselor in Rome or something of the sort. Um, uh, it's been so long now. I don't know if I can tell you those names right now.
Uh, That's okay. Let's look at some of the important events that happened while you were at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You worked, and then subsequently in the office of Foreign Minister Cecil Dennis, correct?
Yes, yes. I joined the office directly as special assistant to the minister following the death of Finance Minister Steve Tolbert. When Steve Tolbert died in this plane crash, Gerald Padmore, who was Cecil Dennis's special assistant, he was assistant minister, special assistant to the foreign minister, was invited to join the finance ministry as deputy minister of finance. And then Cecil asked me to succeed Gerald as his special assistant. That's when I joined his office.
What kind of a man was Minister Dennis intellectually, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of his day-to-day activities in government? What kind of a person was he?
Well, you know that Dennis was a lawyer by training. I think his law degree was from Georgetown University. He was quite a smart man, ambitious, um, um, very much in tune with what was happening on the African continent at the time. And I think he and President Tolbert sort of fitted together in the sense that they saw it in Liberia's interest to move in the direction of the quote unquote progressive African states. Um, and so there was a decided shift in the emphasis, if you will, of the Liberian policy when Talbot came to office, insofar as Africa was concerned. Um, uh, I think, in some sense, one can say President Tupman was a moderate, middle of the road. President Talbot felt the time had come to make common cause with the progressives. And I think I mentioned that one of the indications of this move was that Liberia became a member of the Liberation Committee of the Organization of African Unity. That Liberation Committee was the committee that was in the forefront of the struggle to complete the work of African decolonization, especially when it came to uh, the countries in Southern Africa, and I'm thinking here about apartheid South Africa. I'm thinking about Rhodesia. I'm thinking about the Portuguese territories of Angola and Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and so forth and so on.
So tell us about the role Liberia played, because you were at the foreign ministry at the time with Minister Dennis, and this shift in policy in terms of Liberian foreign policy to focus on the liberation. What role did Liberia play in the decolonization of Africa?
Well, there's a history to that, and that history basically tells us that when the African countries began to move into independence, and go back to 1957, when Ghana became independent, or before 1957, when it was clear that the British and the French understood that the time of colonialism was uh, uh, in the past, and it was time to grant independence to African countries. Liberia decided that it could play a mediating role because you did have on the continent at that point in time countries that were seen as pro-Western and others that were seen as well, non-aligned was used, but they largely leaned more toward the left because they felt that the colonial powers were not very anxious to give up their territories. I'm thinking about the Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, for example, who felt that the Belgians were not being very honest in their relationship with him, and so he veered toward the left. Of course, it cost him his life, unfortunately. But Liberia felt that she was placed in a position where she could mediate between those on the left and those on the right, and in that way, Liberia, uh, if you will, uh, led the process of organizing this new Africa. And I say led the process, I mean that Liberian diplomats were around the world doing research and coming up with proposals. There is a draft charter for the Organization of African Unity, a draft charter that came from Liberia. And that draft charter, if you compare it to the charter of the OAU that was um, put in place in 1963, you will see quite a few similarities between those two. So, in terms of Liberia's role, it was a role of mediation, and it was a role that eventually gave us what we had in the Organization of African Unity, which was, in essence, a an association of African states rather than a union of African states.
South African Prime Minister John Foster, uh, he's the Prime Minister of the racist South Africa at the time, visits Liberia, and the whole world literally is up in arms about the visit. What were the, the circumstances and what was some of the thinking behind allowing Prime Minister Foster to come to Liberia? And was President Tolbert aware that there would be so much heat as a result of that visit in terms of his relationship with the West, United States, his relationship with other countries on the continent?
Now you ask me to speak like a researcher because understand that I am a junior minister at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at this point in time. I, I did not have the opportunity to speak with President Tolbert about why he was doing what he was doing. Just understand that part of it. The other part I think that one needs to point out here is that Liberia is very actively involved in the decolonization process. And obviously, that meant also putting an end to apartheid in South Africa. So Liberia is in communication with the leadership of the liberation movements, the African National Congress, the Pan Africanist Congress, uh, uh, the liberation movement in Mozambique, the liberation movement in Angola. These people are in and out of Liberia. These leaders are coming, these liberation leaders are coming in and out of Liberia. And Tolbert is consulting with them. And they are telling him what is going on behind the scenes, if you will. Um, that's one piece of it. The other piece is President Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, President Houphouët-Boigny of Cote d'Ivoire, President Leopold Senghor of Senegal. All of these people had met with Botha. And so this is known to the Liberian leadership. They did not meet publicly with him, but they met with him. There's correspondence that I have access to about the relationship, the relationship between President Kenneth Kaunda and the South Africans, not only the South Africans, but Ian Smith in Rhodesia at that point in time. So one is aware of all of this. So Talbot is maybe gambling, if some would call it that, by going public. I don't think that he necessarily meant for it to go public because um, it was all supposed to be shrouded in secrecy. But maybe the South Africans had their own agenda, and probably they are the ones who released the information.
So you traveled, literally traveled the world with your boss, Foreign Minister Cecil Dennis. OAU Uganda 1975, OAU Mauritania 1976, OAU Gabon 1977, Liberia, non-aligned countries meeting in Peru 1975, Sri Lanka 1976, and Algeria 1977 when Boumediene was president or prime minister. All of these visits, just summarize some talking points from these visits in terms of your experience as a diplomat and the impact of the visits on Africa as a whole.
Well, we were attending meetings, planned meetings. When I say planned meetings, there were annual meetings of the Organization of African Unity. I think there were biannual meetings of the Non Aligned Countries Movement, and there were annual meetings of the United Nations. So I recall, for example, in 1975, we went to Gabon, probably it was, to the no, to we went to Uganda. I think take that back to the Organization of African Unity Conference, and then subsequently we went to Lima, Peru, to the Non-Aligned Movement meeting, and then finally to the regular session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. I mean, again, these are all routine meetings that all countries sort of were represented at. My role was one of serving as an aide to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, so that if he had to make a speech, I would draft the speech um, using all kinds of documents that were made available to us. Some coming from Addis Ababa, from our embassy there, some coming from the United Nations, um, and then otherwise just being with him when he had to participate in the various debates that were taking place at these meetings. And I remember one of the things that I used to do was to sit behind him and write notes to suggest you do this or you do that. Sometimes he took it, sometimes he did not take it. It depended on what was going on.
President Tubman, to use your words, is a moderate leader. Some would go beyond that. President Tolbert is sort of progressive. In fact, he was a pallbearer at the funeral of Kwame Nkrumah. So Liberia had, under him, Liberia became a member of the Liberation Committee of the OAU. That was a pretty, they didn't give that position to Liberia when President Tubman was president. Generally now, the thinking behind the conclusion I'm arriving at is that Liberia's foreign policy under President Tolbert was pretty progressive. Uh, his domestic policy was not complementary to what he was doing in terms of his foreign affairs. He was a little bit regressive at home, wasn't he? And if so, why?
Well, you know, to answer that question is to raise a bigger question. And that bigger question is what is happening in Liberia in the 1970s? What is happening in Liberia when President Tubman dies in July 1971 and President Tolbert takes over? What is happening in Liberia throughout that period? Um, you want to remember that Finance Minister Steve Tolbert engaged Firestone in a way that was unsettling for Firestone. And when I say in a way that was unsettling for Firestone, in other words, there was a decided shift in terms of government's relationship with Firestone when Talbot became president, as opposed to when Tubman was president. Put otherwise, Talbot asked for a renegotiation of the Firestone agreement, and Firestone was not very happy with that. I'm just mentioning that just to, if you will, set the stage for the shift that is beginning to take place in Liberia's policy. 1973, for example, we have the Organization of African Unity following the Afro-Arab states and deciding to sever diplomatic relations with Israel because Israel was occupying African territory. In this case, we are talking about the Sinai in Egypt. That's also a significant shift because Liberia had very close relations with the state of Israel. But Liberia decides the time has come to join the majority of African states on this particular issue of the Palestinian issue and the occupation of um, Egypt, part of Egypt, by Israel. Again, a decided shift in policy that we see taking place here. So uh, the 1970s is a time of change in foreign policy. The question then becomes one of what's happening at the domestic level, and a lot is going to be happening at the domestic level. Uh, if the word regression is used, it is somewhat is somewhat regression, but not fully that. And the point I'm trying to make when I say that is there was a movement for change in Liberia towards greater democratization, more inclusive governance. And I think Talbot was prepared to carry forward that agenda, that agenda for change. And my evidence for saying this is the relationship that he developed with the opposition forces on the ground in Liberia at that point in time. If you begin to look at the nature of the relationship, the frequency of the exchanges, and so forth and so on with them, you begin to appreciate that. But at the same time that that is happening, there is a reaction to all of that. And that reaction comes from the fact that the leadership in Liberia was comfortable, it would appear, with the manner in which President Tubman ran Liberia, and therefore were not comfortable with what they saw President Tolbert doing. So you had a situation where one is trying to move forward in this change direction that I'm alluding to here. But at the same time, there are those that are pulling back. So we go forward a little bit, we come back a little bit. And of course, various people can then characterize the situation and conclude that what is happening is not progression, but regression. I wouldn't necessarily just call it regression. I think that what we had happening, to put it bluntly, were the forces of change confronting forces of the status quo. So status quo, change, status quo, change. So it's a seesaw, go back, go forward, go back, go forward. That is, I think, one way of characterizing the situation.
So the status quo change clash came to a head in 1979 with the rice riots. And you say in the book that, well, given this background now, it's understandable that this was a little bit more, about a little more than that. It was an opportunity to change the society. But my question really has always been, uh, and in the book you said that the increase in the price of rice was really, and it was a policy objective to make Liberia self-sufficient in the production of rice, our staple. But somehow that uh, narrative got lost on the greater public. How did that happen?
Well, when you have change and status quo in competition, it's easy for that to happen. And I say easy for that to happen because those who want change and immediate change to come about immediately, those who are proponents of, if you will, radical change, are likely to look at what is happening on the side of the status quo, or even on the part of those that might be moderate, and conclude there is an absence of sincerity, that what the government is doing is not a reflection of a desire to bring about the inclusiveness that is being pushed by the other group. Unfortunately, the government was not able to effectively counter that. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, which we can go into a little later on.
Okay, so the question that arises from that scenario directly and specifically is, did President Tolbert increase the price of rice so that he himself and his friends would benefit? In other words, were there rice farmers in the government who stood to benefit from the price increase in rice?
I don't know whether I can speak intelligently to that question, you know, and largely because I have not familiarized myself fully with the fine details of the debate that went on about the issue of rights. What I can say is, on the basis of what I experienced and what I have seen, documents that I have seen and conversations that I have held, I don't think that rice per se was the issue. I think the issue was more, it was rights, RIGHTS, and not RICE. And what I mean by that is that those who challenged the government were not primarily focused on the rice issue. I think they were more focused on the rights issue. It was in that atmosphere very easy to shift. to develop a narrative that basically said there is insincerity here, that the whole intent of the policy is to benefit the people in government who are producers of rice, that they intended to exploit the people. Um, uh, I personally believe very strongly that it was a greater focus on let's change this society and move towards greater democracy.
Okay, so let's hit the other side a little bit. You said something rather interesting in the book because the assumption has always been made subsequently that those who were agitating for change in the context of the Cold War had socialistic inclinations, right? But in the book, you said that Liberians, those who were trying to bring about change, were not socialists, but they were using socialism as a tool. Is my reading correct? And do you, if so, how did you come to that conclusion?
Well, I observed their behavior. I looked at who they were, and we know the personalities. Probably there may be one or two of them who stuck to Marxist Leninism, but I think the majority of them were pragmatic people. And I think in the context of the 1970s, um, it was easy to use Marxist Leninism as a tool to achieve certain political objectives, certain objectives that would hopefully the thinking was move Liberia towards more inclusive governance. Um, I don't think that look at what happened after the 1980 coup. I don't think we saw much in the way of some of these individuals proposing Marxist-Leninist solutions to Liberia's problems.
How successful was the negotiation of Mr. Albert Port, though? How far did he get?
Well, I think he made a valiant effort to mediate between the government and the opposition, if I may put it that way. He had access to the president, and he used that access. In other words, when he could not see him personally, he would write him notes, and those notes got to the president. And he obviously had access to Baccus, Matthews, and all of the other members of the opposition. And I think up to the 11th hour, he was pleading with the president uh, to um, to in effect allow the was it PAL, Progressive Alliance of Liberia, that was leading the demonstration, to allow them to hold the demonstration. Um, but unfortunately, this was not uh, a position that the president wanted to take, and so he did not accede to Mr. Pote's importuning.
And then after everything, the president brings in the Nedisia Branel, the Branel Commission. What were the key findings, maybe two or three points from the commission, the Branel Commission?
Well, Mr. Brownell was a prominent lawyer who had served as Attorney General of Liberia before and who ran into some difficulty with President Tubman and was in prison for a long time, disgraced and in prison for a very long time. And I think President Tolbert thought that in the context of a changing Liberia, he had quite a bit of credibility. And it is this which led him to request Mr. Brownell to serve as chair of this commission. Well, the findings were many. One of them was that the the president should grant amnesty to all of those who were charged with treason, because in the thinking of the commission, This was a charged political situation, and that the application of uh, treason to that situation was not appropriate. Um, there were a number of other things like I think there were specific requests made to cause those who were in the government and responsible for the the riots that took place, people that included the Minister of Justice at the time, the Minister of Agriculture, I think, as well, that they be relieved of their portfolios. And the commission asked the government to extend the time uh, that the commission had to do its work so that it would look into the socio-political issues which were uh, at the at the base of all of this situation that had developed in Liberia at that point in time. But that is something that the government did not do. Rather, I think the president did grant amnesty. Oh, another point was that the decision to increase the price of rice was rescinded. In fact, I believe the price of rice was lowered as a consequence of all that had transpired.
You said the president believed that these people should have a free and fair trial, access to lawyers, and all of that. And then after the coup, some of these individuals were in government, and I don't know if they were in a position to advocate for a free and fair trial with counsel and all of that, but they were summarily executed. Have you sometimes sat back and looked at the irony in that situation?
I don't know whether I have given it much thought. Uh, Clearly, I see the irony, as you now have pointed out. Um, I think that people were not um, using their heads. I think there was a lot of emotions at work. Uh, and I think there was chaos that followed the actual execution of the coup. And it is in that chaotic situation that probably they went ahead and did what they did. I have had an opportunity to see a few manuscripts, one of them by General Kwewampa, that have enlightened me a little bit more about some of what was transpiring. And I still consider the whole thing a major national tragedy because we are still trying to dig ourselves out of a hole that we put ourselves into, both as a result of the coup and as a result of the 14 years of civil war.
Okay, Dr. Dunn, thank you so much for being here with us today. Dr. Elwood Dunn is the Arthur Nagley Professor of Politics Emeritus, University of the South Tennessee, former Minister of State for Presidential Affairs, formerly consultant to Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. He's written numerous books and articles about Liberia. Thank you so much for being here with us today.